Welcome to the Borgen Podcast, the only English language show about fictional Danish politics. On our show, we explore the people, events, and parties that make up the fictional Danish parliament on Borgen. I'm one of your hosts, Amy, coming to you from Istanbul, Turkey, and I am always joined by my good friend and co-host, Chantal, who broadcasts from her room with a fabulous view in Toronto, Canada. How are you doing, Chantal? Welcome to it.
Welcome to it. I'm good, Amy. How are you?
Good. So I'm going to begin by discussing episode 5. And episode 5 focuses primarily on gender, representation, and equality, particularly in the private sector. The political issue in this episode is getting the Danish corporate world on board with a new economic policy that would ensure 50% of all private sector boards be made up of women. The bill is created by Brigitte Nyborg's moderate party and is being tabled via the exciting Minister of Economics, Henriette Klitgaard, whose very existence is controversial because she was a lingerie model in her 20s and has an impressive looking CV with credentials from 4 different universities from America, I think. It's implied overseas anyway. There's tension between her and Pernille Madsen, the gender equality minister, because she thinks that bill should be part of her ministry's portfolio. And Pernille is a representative of the Labour Party. Major pressure in opposition to the bill comes from corporate kingpin Joachim Krone, who is hugely influential. He owns media outlets, many big companies under an umbrella company called Krone Industries, and he demands to meet with BN on her terms to put pressure on her to put pressure on her to drop or change the bill. He does this by telling her that he will pull his businesses out of Denmark, which could be a very problematic situation. His companies are worth 11% of the economy or something. There's pressure on Brigitte to modify or drop the bill entirely. He offers her 48 hours to respond, and Brigitte decides to hold her ground. She's clearly plotting something in the back of her mind, even if she doesn't totally see it yet. She knows caving would look weak and set a bad tone for future economic bills. Henriette causes a lot of tension wherever she goes. The PM's office, where Pernille Madsen feels jealous of her successes, even though Henriette is seemingly good at her position. Madsen calls her strident, which I thought was interesting because that's a word often used against strong women all the time. And it's surprising to hear it come from a character who is a so-called old school red stocking feminist bra burner, as Casper calls Madsen, to another woman in a similar position. Madsen offers to take on some of Henriette's responsibilities if something comes up. Henriette also causes a stir with Casper, who flirts with her by dropping a pen intentionally and touching her hand, and even attempting to kiss her when they have a private discussion about her media strategy. She smacks him and berates him for that, and his weakness is right out there. This is Casper's weakness. Women are his weakness, obviously. Even Brigitte calls Casper a flirt, which he is. Throughout this episode, we see him meet up with Katrine as well a few times. And each time he bubbles over with jealousy about Katrine's new friendship and flirtation with Benjamin, the trainer from the TV1 gym. Casper lets things slip to Katrine about the Madsen-Klitgaard conflict that he shouldn't have, and his footsie and kissing thing are really over the top. It's so obvious, even Brigitte calls him out. Henriette gets called the clit by Ulrich, who gets to interview her when the moderates introduce their bill. He gets to interview her instead of Katrine because showing a women's issue interview being done by a woman with a woman minister is too much girl power for the boys network, Ulrich and Torben, at TV1. Henriette is later put on a second time with Laugesen when he runs stories about her success in the corporate world being connected to the fact she may have or may not have had affairs with men in powerful positions to get where she is today. Pernille Madsen also hints at this. She mentions it. There are modeling shots of her in the papers, in Laugesen's paper, The Express specifically. And he says a bunch of smarmy things in that interview, which would probably not be okay in the post-Me Too world now. Comments like, I like beautiful women on top and in all positions. Like, really? Could you get away with that these days? I don't think so. She even challenges him, saying, no one cares what men do. And Katrine brings up the fact that Laugesen bragged about all his conquests when he was in college. Henriette lets it slip in that interview that certain interests are pressuring the PN's office not to go forward with the bill which she was forbidden to do by the PM. Ultimately, Henrietta faces a big problem, but it is not because of her sex life or her bad interview, but rather because it is revealed by sources connected to Krona, probably, that she lied about her academic credentials. BN supports Henrietta through all the nonsense about her sex life being splashed all over the headlines. But when the documents confirming her false accreditation with 2 of the 4 universities saying she didn't attend them and that her PhD is falsified, Brigitte gives her a chance to come clean. She doesn't really own this mistake, but says to BN, I just do what incompetent men do all the time, embellish the facts. And Brigitte returns with, I don't need an incompetent man, and ultimately lets her go at the end of the episode. Lagerson says the public has a right to know about the morals of the ministers, and he's not wrong exactly, but it's not Henrietta's sex life that gets her in hot water. It's the fact she lied about her credentials. So Brigitte's focus on morals is in the right place, in the area of competence and accountability, not something to do with somebody's sex life or their personal affairs. On the home front, things continue to be tense with Brigitte and the family. The kids get a bit indulged by Philip from time to time, and Brigitte has such a limited time with them. She has to be caught up on news like Laura's test scores and Magnus getting his dad to let him eat Cocoa Pops instead of something healthier. Brigitte delays Krona by 2 hours to eat dinner with the family, and actually Philip is useful and helpful, even though it's obvious that like their sex life is also suffering at this point. They are slowly losing some intimacy, which is a bit sad, actually. Henrietta even causes issues in Brigitte's home life because Philip lets it out that he slept with her at a Christmas party 17 years earlier, when she was a 21-year-old intern and before he knew Brigitte. That doesn't actually seem to be more than a minor irritation to Brigitte, actually. She puts that aside fairly easily. Philip is more useful with his insights on Krona, who he says is so influential, and all of this kind of thing. Krona isn't on the screen a lot, but he does exert a lot of power over the events in this episode. He tells Brigitte in their meeting that he doesn't need the first female prime minister dictating to him how to run business, and that he doesn't need to be told what to do by the PM. Brigitte challenges him, saying they don't just bother breaking up their boys network, and that women are better educated and more qualified than men a lot of the time, and that should be reflected in how business works. He says that if he has to change his ways, he'll take his business elsewhere, out of Denmark. This is where he gives her the 48-hour notice. In that 48 hours, she runs things by Philip, who tells her it's like a poker game. Hold your hand until you're ready to call his bluff, basically. In that 48 hours, all the stuff comes out about Henrietta in the press, but that doesn't actually change Brigitte's position on the bill, and neither does the fact that HK slept with Philip ages ago. That's Henrietta Kildgaard. How does the press get that kind of power? Lagerson's paper is owned by a company that's owned by Krona, so he is the actual influence behind the smear campaign to Henrietta. When Brigitte manages to figure out that Krona is a big fish in a little pond, he runs the largest company in Denmark. He has interests in Denmark with historical societies, and he's friends with the Queen, et cetera, et cetera. She calls his bluff. In their second meeting, he says it's too bad you don't care about the consequences of his threat to pull his business out of Denmark, just because he has to add 3 women to his board. But Brigitte nails it. She says, you won't leave. This isn't just about adding 3 women to your board. She totally calls his bluff. She says that he should reveal himself to be a modern leader adjusting to the new times ahead of everyone else, because you won't let the law force you. That way, you'll get the best and most competent women for your board. So in exchange for that deal and that kind of press coverage, basically, and presenting that image that he accepts the bill like in advance of everyone else and like agrees with it and pushes it forward, he does get an environmental taxation break, but they still agree on the 50% women. Brigitte comes out looking very strong, but after he leaves and we see her alone in her room, she's a bit shaky, and the viewer can tell it causes her a lot of tension, but she won the game. And she stuck by all of her principles, all of them. She never sways on her principles. This episode is full of all kinds of hot button feminist stuff, from men pulling down and disregarding women's influence, from how they treat Katrine at TV1, to Brigitte with Krona, and to Casper losing his shit at every hot girl that walks by, to the slut shaming and insults used by Madsen against Klitgaard. It was interesting that they pitted the two female ministers against each other and that they all gang up on the hot one for being hot and out with her sexuality, especially when she was young. But there is no such standard for men. That happens a lot as a result of patriarchal ways of looking at women. Women end up facing off against each other when the real enemy is the male-based, unquestioned status quo that serves only their own kind. In the end, it's not even Henrietta Gluckard's sexuality that's the problem. It's her lies about her credentials. Brigitte Nyborg overcomes all of it, and nothing touches her personally. Her focus is always on the office of the PM and what she owes to the electorate and to democracy.
Yeah, very loaded episode indeed. And I like the way you've tied it together, talking about, the feminism and the strength that these women are perceived to have. And many women may look at Henriette and envy her, maybe for her looks, for her so-called power, her position that she's there with. But when we look a little harder, it's not what it seems. I don't know if you want to have any discussion points you want to bring up, or you want to just have a casual conversation.
I think it's really interesting that the whole, like, all of those attempts to bring down Henrietta with the, like, you were a lingerie model and you slept your way to the top and this and that and the other thing, it's all totally irrelevant. It's not the thing that brings her down.
Right.
It's the fact that she lied about going to American universities and that she does not have a PhD that caused the problem. And it's, obviously the information that came to Brigitte about those credentials comes from one of Crone's sources, because he owns everybody. Mm. So when she gets that information, Casper says something like, Crone's handed you the weapon he was going to use against you. So you have to seal the deal with him now. So it's almost like an exchange of power. Like, Crone tips his hat to Brigitte's power, realizes that she's not going to back down and she's not bullshitting and she's not somebody he can walk all over. They have to work together. She's equally as powerful as him, and he actually recognizes that. And I thought that was really interesting too. And it's also good that none of that stuff came out about Philip and her, but it was interesting that happened. And I feel like that's like a crack in the marriage as well. Like, there's obviously some tension there, and what's going on, how's that going to affect them later, and her, the thing with the kids, that's obviously it's very much a subplot in this episode, but the viewer knows that it's going to develop into something else down the road. You can tell from this episode alone.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's all I want to say about it. I just thought it was interesting that it's all of that attempt to make this woman look weak for, being slutty doesn't even work, because it's not even the real problem.
It's not the real problem. And what I like in this episode a lot is that, first of all, we see the overt sexism and chauvinism in the TV industry that they've not put. Ulrich is the one that has to do the interview because it's too much woman. There's too many women in this, being exposed right now, and it kind of.
And then he's a drooling puppy during that whole interview. He's like, "Oh, okay, Henrietta, you're so hot." You can tell it's ridiculous. Katrina's yelling at him from behind the scenes. Question her. What are you doing? Don't give in.
It's unprofessional, because first, you're a journalist. I mean, when you're on the mic and you're in the TV station with a woman in front of you, whether you find her attractive or not, you have to stay focused. And exactly. I guess all of us are sort of vulnerable to that. But at the end of the day, we're all human. I said we're journalists first, or they're journalists first, but we're human first. But you have to control yourself and be professional. But this reminded me a lot of, and bringing it back, because Amy and I are both Canadian. This reminded me a lot, Amy, about Sarah McLachlan and Lilith Fair. So Sarah McLachlan is one of my favorite singers in the entire world. She's originally from the East Coast, Canada. Mm-hmm. I believe it's Nova Scotia. And later on, her life took her to British Columbia, where I believe she currently lives, where you're from, Amy. Mm-hmm. And this reminded me in the 90s when she came out with this festival, this music festival called Lilith Fair. And Lilith was named after a goddess. Lilith is a goddess. And I'm not really sure what Lilith means. I forgot. But the point of all this is, in the 90s, there was all this attention paid on, we can't play too many women in a row.
Yeah, exactly.
People are
Yeah.
not going to be interested in that. And
Yeah.
they would strategically space women out and thus giving them less airtime and exposure. And what
Mhm.
Sarah McLachlan did, she came in and was brilliant. In 1997, 98, 99, she came up with this fair, which she had a tour all over North America. I'm not sure if they went to Europe or not, but she had a main stage, a secondary stage, and a
Yep.
tertiary stage, and it was all women.
Yeah,
And
it was a clapback for festivals like Lollapalooza, which were like all guy rock, cock rock, basically.
exactly. And this festival was hugely successful, sold out. And what they did, I love the
Yeah.
activism aspect. So they in every city
Yeah.
they raised up like a local artist, right? And they would
Mhm.
donate $1 of every ticket to whatever charity, which I thought was brilliant. But it reminds me of that here. And you know what I like about this episode is that we really see Brigitte for who she is. So she's a family woman. She is really on at being a PM, but we see her vulnerabilities when Crone leaves.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I
She's like all
also
shaky. Like she's like, oh my God.
she's shaking,
I
and I can only,
yeah.
and that speaks to the presence and the person Crone is, and I guess his power in Denmark.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
you know
And
you
also
just, yeah, you just don't
yeah,
have
and
casual conversations with this type of guy. Like you really have to be on.
yeah, but it also reveals like they're both just people in a negotiation. Like it could be, like
And she
Brigitte's
has to
just
do her
as
job,
yeah, Brigitte's
right?
just as capable at her
Unlike
job as he is at his,
And
you
unlike
know?
Ulrich, she's not being shaken by it. She has
Yeah,
her head on.
exactly.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
the last point about Brigitte I want to make is that we see how forward thinking she is because it
Mhm.
is revealed that Philip slept with Henriette 17 years ago. And Brigitte is not fazed by that because Brigitte knows they all slept with people before they got married. And
Yeah.
they may do that again in the future.
Yeah.
So what's the big deal? Like she's very focused on
Mhm.
everything she
On
does,
the
which I like.
yeah, it's the politics and people's honesty and integrity are more important than their personal life activity.
Right. And not lying because she
Yeah, not
wasn't
lying.
phased that, Henriette had that type of background. She wants the job to be done and she doesn't want people to be fraudulent around her,
Exactly. Yeah,
you know?
exactly. And it was very refreshing to see that take on it. It was
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah. That she had this woman's back and she would have had this woman's back had Henriette not lied.
Yeah, exactly. And she was very supportive of Pernille too, who also wanted like some extra things in exchange. And she actually ends up stepping into Henrietta's shoes basically and gets that ministry and is included in some other economic committees and stuff to ensure the gender equity thing goes on. And it was kind of interesting that like she got her way, but not in the way she thought she would, you know. She got Henrietta out, but not because of the sex thing, because of the credentials thing, which is far more important.
Yeah.
Like
yeah. And even the way Brigitte told Henriette she had to go, it was matter of fact. It was just like,
yeah.
This is it. This is what you said. This is what actually is. And now this is what's going to be. And
are you going to own this or not going to own it? Like
exactly. And there's no Brigitte doesn't go soft on her as a lot of women would, or a lot of people would think women are soft, especially when it comes to something, where you have to be, you have to confront something that's very difficult and awkward, such as telling someone they need to leave, right? Brigitte was strong and solid.
Yeah, exactly. So good. Yeah, and very enjoyable. And I like watching the political play out. And like a lot of these issues are things that have come up in government in the Canadian government and like, for example, the way in Turkey, the Turkish government treated the commissioner of the EU when she came here to speak, and there was like on TV, there wasn't even a chair for her. It was really outrageous. She made a big stink about it.
Really?
Oh yeah. It was really embarrassing. I mean, and what happened here? The lira is tanking. The economy is going. So we'll see how that plays out. You can't be mean to women in power. We notice things.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
All right. So do you want to continue with episode 6?
Episode 6, yeah. So over to me. Episode 6 is a very loaded episode. I had a
Yes, it
challenge.
is.
I had a challenge trying to put all my thoughts down on paper, but without spending any more time talking, let me get straight into it. So, as I call it, this is the episode where Brigitte performs political checkmate. And I remember seeing this episode for the first time, and I just thought it was so brilliant what she did. And I also felt a lot of fear watching the episode of the situations that, she was in and how is she going to get out of it and what is going to happen, because it was very heated politically, right? So I'm going to break this up into 2 sections. The first section is going to talk about the political storyline. The second section will touch upon Brigitte's home life, which I'm going to continue in a bonus episode because I thought it'd be nice to chat about it. And focus this one on the politics, because the politics in this one are really, really strong. So in this episode, this is about Alexander Grozin, the president of the fictional Eastern European state of Kyrgyzia, and Vladimir Bayanov, the controversial Kyrgyzian poet and dissident who has been living in exile from Kyrgyzia for the past 10 years. Both men happen to be in Copenhagen at the same time. Grozin is in Copenhagen because Brigitte is going to pass the chairmanship of the OSDD over to him. As we learned from a phone conversation she has in her office, she, quote, wants to strengthen democracy in the OSDD countries. We know that Grozin is going to buy 1 billion euros in wind turbines. Grozin believes that, like in any country, Kyrgyzia has a responsibility to reduce its CO2 emissions and believes that the future lies with wind energy. This will make Denmark Europe's largest export nation of green energy and will create more jobs and a greener environment. Bayanov, the Kyrgyzian poet and dissident, is in Copenhagen to give a poetry reading, and Brigitte's father is a fan of Bayanov and comes into town for a few days to attend the reading. President Grozin has a reputation for being a brutal leader. He was elected president of Kyrgyzia back in 1996. Bjorn calls Brigitte and says that the Kyrgyzsian embassy wants Brigitte to arrest Bayanov for terror and high treason and the various crimes against Kyrgyzia and extradite him. Brigitte knows that Bayanov has been living in exile for 10 years, and Grozin has tried to have him extradited many times without success, and Brigitte does not want to get involved in this. Now, over to TV1, when Katrine interviews Bayanov, Katrine asks him what democracy means to him. And he says, quote, that's like asking what love is and what love means. It's difficult to explain, but easy to understand. We won't die without democracy. Democracy develops the human race because it focuses us to embrace and understand those who think differently. Katrine tells him that he is one of the most prominent members of the Sarkeesian minority and that he is fighting for an independent state, often with violent methods. She asks if he finds violence necessary. And he says, quote, yes, violence is necessary because Grozin is trying to destroy my people. Now, on to conversations between Brigitte and Grozin. Grozin tells Brigitte that he understands that Bayanov has not been arrested yet, and she responds by saying that they cannot act without evidence. Grozin points out that Bayanov is a well-known terrorist, and she is there with no intentional arrest order on him, and that he is legally in Denmark to talk about his poetry. Grozin tells her that Bayanov was the brain behind the bombing of police headquarters last month, where the chief of police and 5 other men on duty were killed and almost 20 people wounded. He shows her photos and she gives them to her male secretary of the cabinet and tells him to have the Minister of Justice, this is Hoxhaven, assess them right away. Hoxhaven says his legal people do not consider the evidence as conclusive, but that they can arrest him under the new terrorist laws that give the police wider powers. Hoxhaven says it's a serious matter. Casper says that they need to make Bayanov leave ASAP, and that the leak of the fact that Grozin wants him arrested hopefully will scare him into leaving on his own without involving Brigitte, which of course would be the best scenario if they could set the situation up so that Bayanov feels the pressure and the power of what's going on, and he leaves on his own. Now, back at TV1, Torben tells Katrine that the BBC News says that Kyrgyzstan authorities link Bayanov to the bombing of police headquarters and that he's behind a terror attack in Kyrgyzstan. Torben does not want to put Bayanov on the air because the Director General is concerned. So this is obviously a very heated situation here. So Katrine tells Torben that they don't know if he's guilty, which is true. Torben decides that Katrine can talk to Bayanov. If it turns out that he's guilty of terrorism, they won't air the interview. So this is where it gets dramatic now. So we turn to the scenes at the gala performance. They're at Swan Lake. Brigitte is at work and she realizes she has an hour and a half until has to show up at the gala. So she goes home in an hour and a half and gets ready. And she looks so hot and breathtaking that I have problems concentrating. And I need to watch those scenes a few times. And anyways, after I do watch it a few times and grasp what's going on, at the theater now, so we're at the gala at the theater of Swan Lake, Bjorn interrupts Brigitte and during the performance and tells her that the Russian Minister of Affairs wants them to meet and arrest Bayanov, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs is criticizing them for not acting. So a lot of pressure is now on. And Brigitte says that they are warning him and hopefully he is leaving the country now. But Casper tells her that is not the case because Bayanov is actually at TV1 right now talking to Katrine. Meanwhile, Grozin tells Brigitte that Bayanov is still free and he wants to know why Brigitte has chosen to stand by a terrorist instead of the next chairman of the OSDD, which is him. He asks Brigitte, this is Grozin asking Brigitte, quote, do the lives of 8 Kyrgyzstan policemen mean nothing to you? Brigitte says, quote, of course they do, but I cannot preempt a political investigation. And I remember her saying that. She said that with poise and grace and a smile. And Grozin tells her that she, as PM, can order Bayanov be detained by the police and investigate the matter. A lack of goodwill on your part, quote, a lack of goodwill on your part must force me to reconsider my investment in Danish wind energy. Why should I place 1 billion euros in a country that does not care for my people's security? I strongly recommend the immediate action arrest of Bayanov. So Bjorn tells her, Brigitte, that Russia wants him arrested. So we're seeing a lot of political, political leaders sort of invested in this situation, which is creating a lot of tension. And Bjorn is telling her she should arrest him. Russia wants him arrested, but she can release him later. She feels a lot of pressure and she's standing there at the theater and pondering for a few seconds. And then she says, after much thought, arrest him, but discreetly. Brigitte says no to Grozin's request to have Bayanov extradited. She wonders aloud, quote, is Bayanov's head worth $1 billion in wind turbines? When Grozin gets the award, she has to publicly have faith in Grozin and to appear democratic. She says, and Grozin has to appear democratic. She says Bayanov extradited. She says to have Bayanov extradited after the ceremony, i.e. to sign the extradition after the ceremony, the OSDD ceremony. We see from long pauses and visible, difficult contemplation that this is a very hard decision for her to make. Later in the scene, she pulls out a file from her desk and she's kept this hidden. The report is entitled, quote, report on violation of human rights in Kyrgyzstan. And when she opens it, she sees bloody figures of people that were injured in one mass grave where bodies are buried. And to me, as the audience member, what I drew from this, and we can talk about it a little bit later, Amy, is that this suggests that Grozin has blood on his hands, not the other way around with Bayanov having blood on his hands, but Grozin having blood on his hands. So the day after the ceremony now, Grozin comes to her office. He sits down, sprawled out on the chair like a slob, as if he has no respect for Brigitte or the office of the prime minister. He is concerned and wants to know what will happen to Bayanov if she hands him over. He fumbles. She's asking him what will happen to Bayanov if she hands him over to Grozin, and Grozin fumbles and talks about how his people are used to doing as they're told. And his country is, quote, a very young one compared to Denmark. And he doesn't want to discuss it, quote, on a day of celebration. Brigitte tells him she can't hand him over if Grozin won't tell her. He says that the Kyrgyzstan people and law will decide. Brigitte tells him that it will be up to him to decide about Grozin. Grozin changes his tone to something more angry and becomes condescending and says that he will, quote, not take any more arrogant lessons from her and hand over Bayanov before I sign the contract with Northwind. Then a second later, he changes back to a smile and asks Brigitte for a favor. He wants her to select the journalist on a piece of paper he hands to her, and he does not want to take questions from Katrine at TV1. She tells him that her nation believes in free press and upholds it in their constitution. She says, quote, it's part of the OSDD treaty that you're signing today as the new chairman. He swiftly loses his smile and turns condescending again and says sternly to her, there is a time for free press. No more games, Mrs. Prime Minister. The scene changes. We're now at the press conference. It's nearing the end of the episode. We're at the awards ceremony press conference, and it's about to begin. And we see Brigitte hand Casper a piece of paper that contains a question, and she tells him to make sure Katrine gets it. The first question comes from a random journalist, and that is Grozin satisfied with the arrest of Bayanov? Grozin says, yes, he is very happy for the help received from his Danish friends. The next question is Katrine's, and it is, how strong is the evidence against Bayanov? Brigitte answers, that would be a question for the police. I cannot comment on that. Brigitte then quotes Grozin from a speech he made in 1996 when he got sworn in as Prime Minister of Kyrgyzia. Quote, this is Grozin's quote, democracy is not a principle we can bend. It is either yes or no. And today, my nation, Kyrgyzia, has chosen to say yes to democracy. So here we are now, right, Amy, at the final question of the press conference. And this is the one that Katrine has from the piece of paper. And here is the question from Katrine. Does your investment in Danish wind technology depend on the arrest and handing over of Vladimir Bayanov? So yes. Grozin pauses. Oh, I loved it. It was brilliant. Yeah. It was so perfect. So Grozin pauses with a laugh and says, quote, I have great faith in the Danish legal system, and I can assure you that I did not link the wind energy deal with the case against Bayanov. As Brigitte and Grozin shake hands for the photo op, Brigitte, the most brilliant part, political checkmate, as I said in the beginning of this, as Brigitte and Grozin shake hands for the photo op, Brigitte leans in close and says to Grozin, quote, I really appreciate your answer to the last question because I am not going to hand him over. So I thought that was fantastic. And then, just to end my little summary here of TV1, or of this situation, TV1 reporting. TV1 reports Bayanov was detained for the past few days, but left Denmark to go to Paris to speak at a human rights conference. Grozin took over the chairmanship of the OSDD and signed a deal with the Danish wind turbine company. Kyrgyzia has questioned the terms of the contract, so it is not sealed yet. But Grozin has sealed his fate because Brigitte came in with that quote from 1996, which were his words, and used it against him in political checkmate, as I call it. So I'm going to open up to discussion with you, Amy, and talking about this, even though the contract is not signed yet, as I said, Grozin cannot back down because he's at the award ceremony press conference, and the brilliant way that Brigitte set him up, he cannot back down from his words. So what do you think?
I think that kind of political situation happens in this part of the world because, I'm on the edge of Eastern Europe and Central Asia, right? Like, I do live in the only city that's on two continents. And I have traveled a lot in former Soviet bloc countries. And I live in a politically volatile country. It's somewhat politically volatile. In the time I've been here, I have seen huge anti-government protests that lasted an entire summer in 2013. That was the second year I was here. That was the Gezi Park protests, which were huge. And accumulated, a lot of people got arrested during that. It was a protest against the building of barracks in the only park in central Taksim in central Istanbul. And that extended into a nationwide protest. And 13 people were killed by police, and some police officers also died in those altercations. And then in 2015, there was what has been described as a coup attempt here, where the military went after supporters of this cleric who is sheltering in the US. And there was previously this particular person and the leader here were working together. And then there was an ideological split at some point, and it was decided that his supporters are a threat to the nation of Turkey. And people who supported him were rounded up and purged, basically arrested. And then there were elections a little bit after that. And there is a political party here called the HDP. And they are considered by the current government as pro-Kurdish, which means pro-terrorism because of the Kurdish PKK issues, which is kind of like, I mean, they're a Kurdish separatist group and they have resorted to violence and terrorism in the past. In the eastern part of Turkey in particular, it's a very, very volatile topic here, actually. It's a hot button issue. And so, you know, I have seen, you know, the leaders of that party, the HDP party, their leader, their party leader, there were two co-leaders, actually. One of them was arrested and I think released, and one of them has been in prison since 2016 or 2018, something like that. I can't remember exactly the date. And they're not letting him out because they consider him to be in support of terrorism, Kurdish terrorism. So, you know, whether or not, of course, what the leader said is true. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Like, but, you know, it's pretty interesting to see a story like that play out in a fictional program, because like when you know, like for North Americans, like, I mean, yes, all of that crazy stuff happened with Trump, and like, you know, we're both Canadians, so we're like looking over the fence at America all the time. But the world does that, right?
Yeah.
Russia, the big, you know, the permanent member countries of the Security Council in the UN are the big ones. Russia, US, France, England, Germany. Did I say England? And China. Okay. They have a lot of influence. And when political or economic decisions are made in any of those places, there are huge repercussions. So, I mean,
Absolutely.
we saw the insurrection thing in January last year with the Trump
Republicans
people
storming the Capitol.
Yeah. And like, I can't even really believe that happened. And like people get, you know, not being properly prosecuted for that. And like, it's just like, compared to what happens here, though, that seemed very amateurish to me, but because it's not as formally organized, like here, these are very old groups and like old rooted conflicts that have gone on for a very, very long time. But it does not, you know, and having friends my age from Eastern Europe who grew up under dictatorships, like in Romania, in the Czech Republic, in Georgia, having leaders that have blood on their hands is pretty common in this part of the world. And like those kinds of like conflicts and like mass graves and like hidden acts of violence on the government's part, while condemning activists for acting out against it or speaking out against it or revealing the truth, is a very, very common pattern.
Yeah, it's a very dirty game. Like even
it's really dirty.
Someone that doesn't live. I mean, I'm Canadian. I lived in New York for a few years, but I haven't lived in any of these countries that you talk about. And I guess the most exposure I have is, again, watching Across the Fence from the US. But as you say, that's amateurish compared to what, you know, the old school countries are doing and still do. But I think what's great about this whole episode is that you don't have to be from one of these countries to know that the political volume is turned up. Brigitte is really between a rock and a hard place, because on the one hand, she has to preserve, you know, the integrity of this award and passing it on, and, having this great presence of welcoming this prime minister from Tunisia, but not wanting to get caught up in it. But she has no choice. Because she has to deal with it. So I felt a lot of tension watching this episode. I didn't know
me too.
I was a bit scared. I'm like, oh my God, what's going to happen? And
I thought there was going to be a shooting or something, like somebody was going to shoot the poet, you know, or like you never, although it's not an American TV show, so there's probably not going to be a shooting. I was so used to American TV. I'm like, where's the violence?
Yeah.
Bring out the guns.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know?
No guns here.
No guns.
But
no.
I thought what was actually really great, and I talked about the political volume being turned up, and Amy and I are going to discuss this further in a bonus episode, which is going to air after this episode because we don't want these episodes to be too crammed. So what I'm going to talk about in the bonus episode, here we see Brigitte's life truly intersects. So we've got this heated political situation, which she cannot get out of and she cannot back out of. She has to go through it, whether she likes it or not. Then we meet her father for the first time, right? Which is interesting to see who is this woman's father. And then we see her and Philip really butt heads because the father is coming and we know that Philip doesn't get along with the father. And I thought that, again, the home life was pretty difficult and full of drama and tension, but she had to navigate that. And then when she goes to work, so to speak, she still has it. So she never gets a break. But I think it was for me, and like I said, I'm going to expand it on the next episode, is that it was very interesting to see how the males of her life collide with each other. I would say interact, but it's more like collide. And how she's kind of in the middle. Again, she has no control over it. She's kind of there and she has to deal with it. But what struck me about that is the way she speaks, or the way her and Philip corresponded when the news of the father was coming, and how he didn't want to put up with the father, and he was a bit, snippy about it and not happy. And it just made me think about if the roles were reversed, and if he was a housewife and she was the prime minister and she was a man, would he have had that reaction? Right.
Yeah, exactly.
But Amy and I can go into that in the next episode. Is there anything else we want to touch upon on this episode politically?
No, I covered it. I mean, talking about the terrorism charges. Terrorism is such an easy charge to put against someone because it's very hard to prove, but it sounds very dangerous.
It is. And it's kind of like walking on eggshells because you don't know you don't know what the right answer is. You don't really know what's going on. You can't really prove it because there's so many people that are so dirty behind the scenes that you don't know if you can trust them. And I thought it was interesting. We always like TV1. We like Katrine a lot and, her life at work. And I thought the conversation she had with Torben about, she still wants to talk to him. And she stuck up for Bayanov and said, we don't know if he's guilty or not. And so the resolution to that was, okay, Torben tells her, the director doesn't want us to do it, but do it. And if it turns out he's guilty, we won't air it, because they understand the power of this story, not just, for not just for the people in Copenhagen watching, but for worldwide.
The broader repercussions. Yeah.
Yeah. And what would happen?
Once Russia sticks their nose in, it gets really tricky. You don't want to mess with them.
Yes. All right. So if you have no other points to make, then we're good. I'll close this off, and I hope listeners will join us in the next episode where we dig more into Brigitte and her father and Philip, their relationship together. We'd like to thank our listeners for joining us in this episode. You can check us out on our website, theborgenpodcast.com, where all of our podcast episodes are archived, and you can learn more information about us and the show. We'd like to thank our good friend Garth Jensen for providing the intro and outro music. Thank you very much, Garth. And
thanks, Garth.
And lastly, don't forget to check us out on all social media platforms. We are there and we'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to connect with us and share what's on your mind by using the hashtag the Borgen Podcast, and by sending us an email or voice memo at theborgenpodcast@gmail.com.
Perfect. Thanks, Chantal.
Thank you, Amy.
See you next episode.